And good morning, ladles and gingerbreads. Lovely to have you with me. I'm Tad. Um, I think I was when I got up today, but it was a long time ago, and I'm not quite sure. But anyway, lovely to have you with me, and good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on what part of the world that you are in. I feel like I've been here all day. Not that I have, but I was up early today because we had a get together online with a number of friends, a memorial for a dear friend of all of ours among our particular online community. Not this online community, but the one that was based long ago around the Shadow March board. So we had that this morning because we were trying to accommodate a group of people from many different countries, just like we're doing tonight. So, or this morning, or whatever it is. So that's where I'm at. I'm still a bit dazed and confused. Weekends are very jet laggy for me, but enough about me. Let's talk about me some more. No, there's not really much to talk about. Just been doing the usual. Some improving news. We have an idea that we might be eligible to get, especially our daughter and her partner, shots. So for COVID-19. So we're waiting on that. That would be coming up in the middle of March, which would move us along direction toward being able to have a little more normality in the household, or at least a little less paranoia about things. Other than that, just the usual. Everybody milling around, doing stuff, staying involved. Children having incessant and endless conversations about video games and computer games that, of course, Deborah and I know nothing about. So it's kind of like sitting at a table full of people speaking a foreign language. I mean, we understand the language, and we know they're talking about games, but we don't play those particular games that they're discussing so enthusiastically. So anyway, so as usual, the household is full of voices, full of noises. Even one dog less, there's still quite a bit of pet action going on around here. And it's been fairly nice, except windy, of course, which terrifies the big dog and is a problem all day long when it's windy because he's just not happy. Anything else of news or interest to tell anybody? Not really, just working on stuff. As I think I've mentioned a few times, I have now gone back to the Navigator's Children, which, although I had already written I believe the correct publishing term is a metric butt ton of pages. I was at something like 1,300 pages, but I'm going back and changing things and cutting some bits out so that I can add other bits in and stuff like that. So it's God only knows what the final book will be, but that's ongoing. So anything else to tell you? Not really. We're just doing what we're doing here, and I'm still doing what I'm doing, and Deb's knitting and doing business, and that's where we're at. So anyway, let me check in, see who is here, and who has said hello. Ronnie, good morning to you. Ilva, hello. Last night, see, it's confusing to me because, of course, it was early morning, hideously early morning for me. I had to actually get up before 10 o'clock, which, for somebody who can't get to sleep these days until after 4 in the morning is too darn early. But it was lovely to see you, Ilva, and lovely to see all the other folks, and actually see you for once, instead of it just being me looking at my own stupid face while I'm talking to people, as I'm doing right now. So maybe one of these days we'll figure out a way to put people on the screen and we'll do this like a proper talk show or something. But for the moment, I'm going to work with what I have. So anyway, it was good to see you too. Petra, lovely to see you. Hertie, a pleasure. Wouter, good to see you. And Holger from Waldesruhe. And nice to hear from you, and nice that we can all sit together. Absolutely. Rosalba, a pleasure. Carol, good morning to you too. Chris, hi, nice to see you. And Christine, pleasure. Reading Empire of Grass. That sounds familiar. Jeremy says, Guten was immer Uhrzeit es ist. Good was immer, whatever time it is. See, I can still read some German. I'm not completely gone yet. Anyway, Jessica from misty northern Germany. Hello, willkommen. Good to see you. And who else is here? Andreas. Hello. Good to see you. And it was nice to see you briefly yesterday as well. And Jessica, good to see you too. Cliff, hi Cliff. And Mihai, hello Mihai, how are you? And Svan, good morning to you. And Karen, good morning. So that's who's checked in so far. I'm sure there are others out there watching. You don't have to feel that you must check in. Nothing like that. It doesn't work that way. It's just me reading. So if you want to come and say hello or join us or chat with some of the other folks online, I don't tend to read the messages while I'm reading the book because I am at that advanced age where I have to have two different pairs of glasses to do those two different things, or I have to have my glasses off to do some things and glasses on to do other things. And frankly, it's just too much trouble. So I'm just going to read, but I do tend to look at the messages later on. So feel free. And as I mentioned that, lots of other nice people online that you can say hello to. Find out things that you have in common or make plans to go to other countries and meet people in case you're one of those kind of people meeting people. The dear friend that we were commemorating today was one of those people who just makes piles of friends. So she knows a lot of people overseas, and a lot of them know her or knew her as well. And so we had people from all over the place on our conversation today. And it always reminds me of how amazing it is to me, even after all these years, to be fortunate enough to have people reading things that I wrote in languages I can't even speak. I can speak a couple, but I still probably will not have time in my lifetime to learn Bulgarian or, a few other languages, Chinese, Russian. I apologize. I would, if I could, I would learn all the languages because I love languages, but it's just an utter thrill. I remember going to Croatia and in Zagreb and, going to a bookstore to do a signing and there's all these people lined up and I'm just astounded. I'm going, how could, they're not even reading the books in the language I wrote them, so either I've got a really good translator, which is often the case, or somehow I've fooled all these people into thinking that my work is relevant even to people in non-English speaking countries. Wow. And it's also particularly strange with Tail Chaser because, of course, that was my very first book. I wrote it kind of on a dare to myself. And the fact that it's still in print and people still bring it up to me to sign all these many, many, many years later. We literally are approaching 40 years on that book. It never ceases to amaze me and delight me, I hasten to say. It's just the nicest feeling because one of the things about being a reader when I was young is I always wanted to get a chance to meet the people whose books I really, really liked because I felt that I had made a connection with them. And so I completely understand that when people do the same thing with me. I'm extremely gratified by it, but I also completely get it because one of the lovely things about books, and I think in some ways even more so than most other art forms, but certainly it's up there, is the way that we feel connected to the people whose books we read and the way that we feel almost as if we know those people. And many times, I still, to this very day, have the experience where I'll be reading something and just go, God, I wish I could sit down with this person because I'm sure we would get along really well and I'd be able to throw out some really crazy ideas and see what they thought about those and find out things about them that isn't apparent in their work. And, so when I'm on the other side of that, my first thought is always, wow, this is so great. This is just like what I always wanted to do. And now, I can meet people who want to meet me and presumably enjoyed my books or else are just involved in a very, very complicated murder plot of some kind where they have to go stand in line at a bookstore before getting a chance to kill me. Which I admire, right? I do. I admire. Anyway, all right. So I'm babbling. Hello, Alan. Welcome to whatever the hell it is that we do here. So Jessica, yes, it would be awesome to speak all those languages. I wish I'd learned about 6 or 7 of them when I was young instead of just French and Spanish. I have learned some German over the years, but it's much harder now. For one thing, because my brain is just not as flexible as it was. But it's also just, I can't sit down and be in school and do homework and stuff like that. Not if I want to get anything else done. But yeah, languages are amazing, and when you can speak another language even a bit, it completely changes your interaction with people, especially when you are the traveler or the visitor in somebody else's country. Um, even if you just speak a bit, just enough to get around and stuff, you still will meet people you wouldn't meet otherwise. And the more of a language other than your own that you learn, the more insight that you have into the culture that caused that language to be and that shaped that language. So I've always found languages just fascinating. And I think that's one of the reasons I fell in love with Tolkien's work, was that he was so obviously a lover of language and words. And I don't mean just in the sense of the way that he created his own language of Elvish, although that's a pretty impressive example, but also just the way in which he loved and resurrected certain words that were especially Anglo-Saxon, which was one of his main fields of expertise. So there's a line in Lord of the Rings where, God, I've forgotten who it is that says it now, whether it's Theoden or somebody, who says when the Lord of the Nazgul shows up on his giant flying, we don't exactly know what it is. It was in the book, it kind of sounded like a triceratops, like a pterodactyl or something. In the movie, obviously, it was more of a flying dragon kind of thing, the Nazgul's flying beast. But the character says, whoever it is, says, "Begone, foul Dwimmerlake." And that's spelled Dwimmerlaik, Dwimmerlake. And I just went, what an amazing word. And Tolkien loved stuff like that. And I think that's, where I made a lot of those connections when I was young. That's why I loved Dickens as well, and why I loved Ray Bradbury and Thomas Pynchon and Kurt Vonnegut, all people who love words and wordplay. Anyway, enough of Tad Babble. Going to go back to War of the Flowers. And that was the serious music part to show you that it's a serious part of the story. War of the Flowers. Okay. Anyway, so what has happened the last time we were reading is that Theo had gone through the entire explanation from Eamon Dowd, his person who he had thought was his great uncle, and whose book kind of got him on this whole track of winding up in fairyland in the first place. And of course, one of the things that he found out was that he was not actually related to Eamon Dowd, who's become the remover of inconvenient obstacles. During the course of this explanation, where Theo discovers that he was actually the last heir of the Violet family, which has been destroyed by the bad guy fairies. And he learned that the remover of inconvenient obstacles had done all this because he had fallen in love with a fairy woman. But then, just at the last moment, Tansy, the guy who had betrayed Theo, and Antoninus Hellebore, who is the son of the leader of the bad guys, showed up, grabbed him, killed the remover of inconvenient obstacles, Eamon Dowd, and set the place on fire. And so at this point, Theo has been taken back to the person who has ordered all this, who is Anton Hellebore's father, Nidris Hellebore. Okay, so that's where we go. We're going to start with that. So Theo has just been brought in along with Cumber, and they are bound and restrained, and they've been brought in to meet Nidris Hellebore. As they've gone through the streets of the city, by the way, they've seen that there's a lot of weird stuff going on, and basically Button, the goblin, Mudbug Button, the goblin, has essentially declared war on the powerful families of the city and has officially broken the ancient treaty that has kept the goblins under control by breaking the stick that it was written on. So that's where we are, and now we're going back to Theo being brought in to meet Nidris Hellebore. Out loud, and with his voice only shaking a little, Theo said, "And you must be Satan, Lord of Darkness." Nidris Hellebore actually smiled a little. "And you must be the last of the violets. What a tiresome family. Like birds, musical, flighty, shrill. But the nest has long since fallen from the tree, and nearly all the eggs are shattered." He shook his head, dismissing the tiresome business of the destruction of an entire clan. "The rest of you out there may also come into the office. Do not waste any more of my time than is necessary." His son and Tansy entered, along with the 4 constables, 2 of whom were still propping up Cumber. Nidris Hellebore raised an eyebrow. "Guards, you are dismissed." "Are you sure, Lord Hellebore?" Tansy began, and then abruptly fell silent. The constable showed an open palm salute before marching out. "They're both bound, Father," said Anton Hellebore with a touch of pride. "Helpless? Something new of mine." Lord Hellebore came out from behind the desk and moved behind Theo. It was hard to keep still, stinging anise or no stinging anise. Just the proximity of the fairy lord brought a deep chill of unease, like knowing Dracula was examining the back of your neck. "I don't think we'll need these anymore," Hellebore said. Something flicked Theo's wrists. A moment later, the pressure of the anise cuffs was gone, and his wrists were prickling with returning circulation. "But, Father—" "Don't be petulant, Antoninus. Do you really think that a physical restraint around their arms is better than what I can do?" All of a sudden, Lord Hellebore was in front of Theo again. His hand came up so quickly that Theo did not even begin to flinch until after Hellebore's finger had tapped his forehead. He seemed to have put some kind of freezing dot on Theo's skin, something so cold it burned, but before even a second had passed it became less intense and yet somehow wider, spreading across his skin and into the muscles, tangling itself around Theo's spine like a climbing thorn. "You will go wherever I tell you to go," Hellebore said. "You will do whatever I tell you to do. For now you will stand and listen and speak only when I ask you a question." "Die, you corpse-faced bastard," was what Theo wanted to say, but as in those nightmares where he tried desperately to scream but couldn't, only a tiny whistle of air escaped his mouth. As he struggled against silence, Hellebore moved in front of Cumber. The Farisher's eyes were wide with terror. "What does this one know?" he asked. "Perhaps nothing, Lord Hellebore," said Tansy. "We brought them straight to you." "I brought them," Anton proclaimed. "I was in charge." "Yes, and you made some other decisions as well," said his father. "Not very good ones, in fact." He touched Cumber's forehead and repeated the words he had said to Theo, then made a broader gesture. Lights began to gleam against the dark walls, or perhaps even within the walls themselves. Theo could suddenly see that the space was quite large, that the desk was in one corner of an octagonal room some 40 yards across. The walls were windows, a complete circle of windows providing a spectacular penthouse view of the city, spreading away on all sides. A view that made Hellebore House appear to be what it had now become in fact, the hub of Fairy. Staring at the 360-degree cityscape, Theo found that he still had a little freedom of movement, could move his head and arms, even shuffle his feet a bit. He tried to take a small, inconspicuous step backward and discovered that he didn't have that much freedom. He was held to the spot where he stood, as though magnetized. Hellebore gazed at a patch of light across town that blazed like a highway flare.
I see a fire in the warehouse district, Antoninus. Why is there a fire? The remover's place was full of traps. The younger Hellebore was suddenly fighting a stammer. We couldn't. I had to. Hellebore's voice was ice. We will talk about it later. I am not pleased. Just now, however, we have more important things to do. He looked up at nothing at all for a silent moment. Ah, the others have arrived and are on their way up. He turned his queerly uninterested stare on Theo. You are struggling to say something. You may speak. Use the chance wisely. Theo swallowed the insults he wanted to spit at him. You've got a friend of mine in a jar. May I see her? Hellebore considered for a moment, then nodded his head at Tansy, who ran to Hellebore's massive desk and lifted out the bell-shaped jar from the place it had been hidden. You may walk to the desk and have your reunion. Theo dimly heard Anton Hellebore protesting, heard his father's low, amused voice replying, but he did not care about any of it. He moved toward the desk, feeling altogether normal, except when he tried to step more than a little bit out of the way, at which point a kind of numb cramp set in, until he turned his foot back in the right direction again. He stopped in front of the desk, more or less of his own volition. She was standing with her tiny hands pressed against the inside of the bell jar. Oh, Theo, I am sorry, she said. He could barely hear her. Tears filled his eyes. It's my fault, not yours. She said something else he could not make out. What? You may open the jar. Father, do you think that's wise? Open the jar. Theo only wished he had done it sooner, so that it felt like his own idea, his own gesture. His hands moved toward the heavy glass vessel and lifted it away from the base. Applecore took a moment to fan her wings and then sprang into the air to hover in front of him. She was crying, too, and that upset him more than had any of the pain inflicted on him. I'm sorry I dragged you into this shite, Theo. Really, I am. What are you talking about? None of this was your fault. I was the one who brought you out of your world in the first place. She was pale and bony thin and had bruised-looking blue circles under her eyes. It's good to see you, Applecore, he said quietly. It really is. Cumber and I thought you were dead. She darted a pitying look over at Cumber Sedge, then stiffened when she saw who stood beside him. Tansy, she said slowly. What in the name of the bloody trees are you doing here, you traitor? I heard Hellebore talking about you. You sold us all out, you lying, murdering. Before Theo or anyone else could move, she had darted across the room and was buzzing around Quilius Tansy like a maddened hornet. He swatted at her. Stop her! My face! She's going... Somebody kill her! Hellebore spoke in a deep, untroubled voice. Walk to the window. Theo wondered who the fairy lord was talking to, and understood only when his own legs began to carry him toward the nearest panel of the city panorama. He tried to fight, but could not. It was as though Hellebore had reached directly into his spine and was manipulating his nerves like the strings of a marionette. The view of the city shimmered and distorted, stretching, bending, then began to dissolve like some ultra-slow view of a soap bubble popping. There was another window behind it with an identical city view spreading below. Hellebore must have mirror screens in front of the window so he can look at things besides the view, Theo thought absently. He's got spiders, dragons, and all the modern conveniences. Then the outer window began to open, sliding up like a rising eyelid, and Theo could feel cold air slapping his face. Stop! Applecore shouted. All right, Hellebore, I'm off, Tansy. Just make him stop.
Theo took 3 more steps before halting at the frame of the open window. Each time he swayed in the wind, he could feel how easy it would be to tilt too far forward and simply tumble into space, go spinning down through the air to the ground many hundred feet below. A few small drops of rain patted against his cheeks and forehead. If Hellebore misjudged how long and how steadily he would stand on his tired legs, there was nowhere to go but down.
Sprite, I allowed you out of the jar because now that we have the last of the violets in our custody, you no longer matter, said Lord Hellebore. But when you attack one of my employees, you become an annoyance. Rather than waste our time and impair our dignity chasing you, I instead remind you who wields the power.
Applecore was still hovering above Tansy, just out of his reach.
But you wouldn't go through all that trouble to get him, and then chuck him out a window, now would you?
Her defiance was not entirely convincing.
There is some truth to that, Hellebore said, but I could have him pull out one of his own eyes without impairing his usefulness at all. I'd prefer not to have a mess like that in my office, however, so if you irritate me, I will simply throw the Farisher out a window instead. Now I am through talking to you.
Applecore looked back at him hard as a person her size could look at the master of all fairy, anyway, then zipped across the room and landed on Theo's shoulder.
Get away from there now, Theo, she said, please.
You may step back from the window, said Hellebore, and Theo suddenly found that he could. He took a few steps backward, and his knees finally gave out, and he half sank, half fell to the floor, clutching the carpet as though at any moment the room might turn sideways and send him tumbling back toward that open window, that leap into nothing.
Lord Foxglove and Lord Thornapple are in the outer office, announced a crisply inhuman voice.
They are late.
Send them in. Hellebore turned to his sulking son. For the time being, I think we should find some secure accommodation for Master Violet, or whatever he is to be called.
Oh, yes, father. The younger Hellebore seemed to perk up a little.
But not in the laboratories. Do you understand me? He is not to be experimented upon. I have a far more important use for him.
The outer door opened, and 2 well-dressed fairy men walked in, both lean, both in that indeterminate middle age that, as far as Theo could tell, indicated they had reached at least a few centuries of age. One had reddish gold hair, straight and hanging to his collar in a way that in any other city would seem intentionally foppish. He wore a huge medallion on the chest of his tailored suit and had a certain watchfulness in his manner that Theo guessed might be the fairy equivalent of nerves. The other, his unnaturally black hair so dark as to seem dyed, but still no blacker than his spider silk suit, and with bushy white eyebrows in weird contrast, was clearly Poppy's father. Theo did not have much attention left for anything but minute-to-minute survival, but it was still very disturbing to see the face of the woman he had come to care for so much reinterpreted in her father's stony mask. Thornapple looked Theo over with some interest.
So, this is the Violet heir. He does not look like much.
Your daughter likes me a lot more than she likes you, buddy, was what Theo wanted to say, but of course he didn't.
Your pardon, Nidris, said the golden-haired one, Lord Foxglove. We were delayed. The streets are full of troublemakers.
I know. Hellebore waved a white hand in casual dismissal. We will find the little goblin soon, I think. A depressing public execution is the best example for the shirkers and ne'er-do-wells blocking our thoroughfares. Thornapple gave him, meaning Hellebore, a curious look.
Have you not heard? It is more than the unemployed and the usual rabble-rousers. The goblins are rioting, Hellebore. Rioting! They have set fires all through the Sunlight District and come flooding out of Goblin Town. At this moment there are thousands of them surrounding New Mound House and threatening to burn down the Parliament. At least 20 constables have been killed already. By the Grove, have you been ignoring your calls all day? Hellebore, for the first time, seemed surprised. Because of a broken stick? Are you telling me that the only thing that has kept the goblins orderly was some ancient treaty? He turned and flicked his fingers at the windows. The cityscape shimmered and vanished as the mirrors came on, the elevated view replaced by street-level perspectives of angry crowds fighting with armored constables. Theo guessed that an ornate multi-story building behind the scene of conflict, a little like a white, gray, and gold wedding cake, must be the place they called New Mound House, the parliamentary building. He was surprised and pleased to see that it was not only goblins who seemed to be fighting against the authorities. Many types of fairies were there, including some that, except for their wings, looked not much different from Hellebore and his peers. They had thrown together barricades across the streets and built fires in trash cans. Rocks and other objects were banging off the constable's shields, but for the moment, it seemed a bit of a standoff. "It won't do them or us any good," Applecore whispered in Theo's ear. "The flowers are too strong, but it's grand to see, isn't it?" Oberon's blood. Hellebore stared at the scene, his mouth twisted, as though he had eaten something very sour. "Set fires in our city, will they? Then I will see Goblin Town burned to its foundations, and the ground seeded with salt. A whole goblin generation will. His eyes narrowed. What is that? A disturbance was eddying through the crowd of goblins and their allies, a surge as though the mob were some unicellular animal about to divide itself and reproduce. A gap formed, and people threw themselves out of the way, barely avoiding the mounted riders who crashed out into the street of the paved no-man's land in front of the startled police. Theo bit back a shout of surprise. He had seen these riders before, and also their single-horned mounts. "Grims?" snarled Foxglove. "Where in the name of the elder trees did they come from?" They were weirdly stirring in their bright furs and feathers, something not just out of an earlier, wilder era of fairy, but out of a dream, a full-blown nightmare. Spears and spiral horns flashed, and bell-mouthed rifles gouted fire as the howling troops surged forward. Theo thought that with their gleaming yellow eyes and painted faces stranger than any mask, the wild goblins looked altogether uncontrollable, like all of Halloween lifted up and flung forward by a hurricane wind. The constables who stood in their way with riot shields locked together did their best to stand up to the hundreds of spear-wielding riders and razor-hooved unicorns, but the Grims had the advantage of momentum. Within moments they had crashed through the police line, scattering the constables, spearing dozens and crushing as many more under their mounts' kicking, silver-hooved feet. Heartened by the charge, the mob surged forward with a rising, rumbling shout of gleeful bloodlust that even through the mirror stream lifted the hairs on Theo's neck, and fairy and goblin alike threw themselves on the reeling parliamentary guard. "Where did the Grims come from?" Foxglove demanded again. "How could all those cursed hill country vermin have got into the city?" Thornapple had one hand on his ear as though he were listening to a headphone, although of course there was no headphone. "It is not just Strawflower Square," he said. "I have reports that they are all over the city. Larkspur's secretary says that they have surrounded his family tower in Longshadow, that wild goblins have destroyed the guardhouse and set the grounds on fire." "It can't be," said Foxglove. Hellebore did not waste his time protesting the obvious. He walked to his desk and touched the side of it. "I want to speak to Snake Root, at the caves, he said. Tell him this is a class 4 alert. I need all the available animals. Black iron, said Thornapple, surprised. Are you really going to use them again? Yes, said Hellebore. Would you like me to send them to Thornapple House too? No? Then be silent. Theo barely listened, staring at the screen with a muted joy. It would be no help to him or his friends, he knew, but it was good to see somebody striking back at Hellebore and his crew, to see them alarmed and forced to scramble. It was Button's work. It had to be. Somehow, Button had managed to smuggle wild Grims into the city. Wild Grims and their unicorns, too. Oh, my God, he said quietly. It was us. What? Applecore leaned in close. Nothing. I'll tell you later. If there is a later. He didn't want to miss any of what was going on, but he felt sure that, with the help of Streety Nettle's strange gift, the entrance permit to the city he and Sedge had obtained for one individual and one livestock animal had become multiplied. My God, Button must have had them coming into the city through every single checkpoint. A dozen here, a dozen there. Theo felt a quiet glow of pride that he had helped throw this particular monkey wrench into Hellebore's smooth-running machinery. Indeed, it was turning out to be a fairly good-sized wrench. It was now almost impossible to make complete sense of what was happening on the ring of mirror screens. Several small blazes had sprung up around the edges of New Mound House, a few even on the roof. Theo had no idea how anyone had managed to get fire up there, until he saw one of the wild goblins lean back in his saddle and put a flaming arrow through one of the Parliament building's upstairs windows. The protectors and the mounted Grims seemed to have control of the field, with all the parliamentary constables killed, lying wounded, or in retreat. The Grims were forming up to ride again, leaving the protesters in a spasm of joyful destruction, uprooting benches and starting to smash in the front doors of New Mound House. A cascade of golden bugs sluiced out of the broken doorframe and skittered away across the steps, following each other in blind compulsion right into a pile of flaming trash. Pale, anxious faces peered down from the upstairs window. Theo thought he should feel sorry for them. Many of them were probably nothing but functionaries, trapped now between fires and an angry mob, but at the moment he had problems of his own. A word, a horrifying word, yanked his attention back to his captors. But if you bring in the dragons, said Thornapple, the destruction may keep us pinned here for days. Theo flinched as though he had been punched in the stomach. That big black snake squirming across the sky. We cannot wait that long, Nidris. You know that, Thornapple continued. You said yourself there is only a brief time when the invocation will work. Let Monkswood and his constables handle this. Revenge must wait. I insist. Hellebore looked at the first counselor of Fairy with a face so hard and expressionless that Theo saw for the first time how too much rationality could be a form of madness. I do not think you can insist, Owlus. You are right that the destruction will interfere with our plans, but that does not mean we will refrain from teaching these skin-eaters a lesson. It merely means we must move up our schedule. He touched his desk again. Ready 3 battle coaches. We are leaving now. He smiled at his co-conspirator, who did not smile back. It was one of the creepiest things Theo had ever seen. If he were Thornapple, Theo thought, he'd be planning to find himself another world to live in as soon as possible, because there was clearly only going to be one big dog in this particular kennel before much longer. We will proceed to the cathedral. In fact, if we are lucky, we will not only accomplish our main task, but also pass 1 or 2 very fine vantage points along the way, where we can pause to watch the punishment being administered to that ungrateful rabble. A moment later, 6 armed constables and a pair of ogre guards entered, their appearance so sudden that even Thornapple and Foxglove were visibly startled. Hellebore was still issuing orders to the air. And prepare the child. Yes, now. We will be there in moments. He turned and walked toward the door. All the others, even the flower lords, fell in behind them without protest. 2 constables dragged Cumber toward the door. 2 more moved to take Theo's arms, but there was no need. He was already following Lord Hellebore like a dog on an invisible leash. One of the constables swatted half-heartedly at Applecore, where she sat on Theo's shoulder, but she pulled herself into the tangle of hair at the side of his neck. Theo wanted to say something brave and reassuring to her, but he couldn't. Even though it appeared they were actually going to leave Hellebore House, something he hadn't believed would happen, it was all still too hopeless. Nidris Hellebore's spell of control lay on top of him, like a lead blanket, something he could carry as he walked, but just barely. Theo quickly lost track of the twists and turns of the hallways, the doors that appeared from nowhere in empty halls. But although the air had grown notably warmer, they had been walking for only a few minutes when a figure in a white cloak appeared in the hallway before them. For a fairy, he was displaying a great deal of emotion, most of it nervousness. My lord, I did not expect. That is, I thought we had until tomorrow, at least. The portents were all taken for tomorrow. The scrying, the oneiromantic metering. Hellebore barely looked at him. Is he ready? In a moment. He's being dressed to go outside. He was just finishing his meal. We were caught by surprise. Then that is all I need from you, Weft Iris. You may return to your other work. The fairy in white still seemed agitated. But my lord, if it is to be today, do you not wish me to accompany you? To accompany the child? That is, there is so much about him. That is, I have worked so long and hard. If we succeed, you will be rewarded. Go now. Weft Iris stared for a moment, then ran his hands through his hair, bowed, and stepped away through a door. Nidris Hellebore stood waiting, patient as a statue, but Foxglove and Thornapple looked a little uncomfortable. Cumber Sedge gave out a quiet whimper of pain and despair. Theo felt something hovering over his thoughts like a storm cloud, and it was moving nearer each moment. Every cell of his body seemed to contract in fear. Only the guard's firm grip on his arms kept him from dropping bonelessly to the floor. It's coming. It was very close now. He felt sick, hopeless. The thing that's been waiting for me. The thing in my dreams. The door opened, and 2 fairy women led out a surprisingly small figure in a thick hooded cloak and equally heavy pants and shoes, something that looked for all the world like a child setting out on the fairyland equivalent of an Arctic trek. The women's skin gleamed with moisture, their movements were sluggish and their eyes heavy, as though they had been drugged. But as they adjusted the cloak and hood, they still seemed to go out of their way to avoid touching the little figure. Theo knew just how they felt. At this moment, he wanted nothing more than to put distance between himself and this small, silent thing. Is there anything else he needs? Hellebore asked, betraying impatience. It is time. The hood fell back, revealing a pink, childish face and curly brown hair. Despite the enormity of his fear, Theo's attention snagged for a moment on a detail. A little spot of blood on the boy's lower lip, and the tiny arm and wingtip that protruded from his mouth. The child sucked it in, chewed, swallowed, and then smiled a dreadful, satisfied smile. I am ready, stepfather. The brown eyes turned from Hellebore to Theo. And here you are at last, my half-brother. We meet face to face. For a dizzying, nauseating moment, Theo felt certain the child creature was in his head again, that he was seeing through two sets of eyes simultaneously, both the child looking at Theo and Theo looking at the child, like two mirrors facing each other. Then he realized he was seeing his own features, his family's features in the face of this little monstrosity, as if it were all the punchline of some dreadful joke. It was like staring at one of his own elementary school pictures, but on a hit of bad acid. The obscenity of his own nose, his mother's thin nose, with what was still a childish upturn, his father's stolid jaw gleaming beneath the oiled pink skin. But the eyes, except for the color, they were nothing to do with his family, or with anything human. They were as dead as something in a mortuary jar. "Oh, save the elder trees," Applecore said in a shocked whisper. The last piece of Dowd's story suddenly fell into place. He's the changeling, Theo thought. No, I'm the changeling. He's my parents. He's the real child, the lost child. Theo suddenly jackknifed at the waist and threw up what little there was in his stomach. "Not such a happy reunion, I fear," said the boy. "I hoped for more, since we shared so many interesting dreams. We are almost twins, after all." Hellebore made a noise of disgust. "Clean that up," he told the two dazed women. "We are taking the boy with us now." He looked at the terrible child for a moment. "Shared dreams?" He barked an angry laugh. "It seems you two have a deeper bond than I have been told." "I am often bored, stepfather. It was a small, private pleasure." Hellebore shook his head. "I do not like surprises. This connection makes for uncertainty at a time we cannot afford any." "He is weak, stepfather, and I grow stronger by the hour." "Still," he frowned, "the remover might have been able to answer some questions about the exact nature of the relationship. But thanks to my eldest son, we have lost that resource." "But, father," Anton Hellebore protested, "I did it for you. I did it because—" "Close your mouth. I am tired of your whining. Everyone, into the coaches. We have urgent business. Tansy, you will travel with me and our long-lost Violet. And the child, of course. I have questions about what happened at the remover's house on the waterfront." I can tell you everything you need to know, father," protested Anton, but was ignored. "Things have changed, apparently," said the child. "We are leaving early." "There is resistance." Hellebore turned to the others. "Come, we are wasting time. I am about to make an example of some malcontents." The group began to move rapidly down the corridor. Theo, still staggering, had to be all but carried by his guards. The little obscenity reached up and wrapped his hot, wet hand around Theo's, who was too weak to pull free of the surprisingly firm grip. "I have finally met my true brother." The terrible child again showed his perfect teeth, which only made the spot of blood on his mouth harder to ignore. "It is too bad. We will be separated again so soon." And we've got some time left. I can start another chapter. So, chapter 40. Strawflower Square. Even after all the oddities he had seen in Fairy, the creatures standing at attention outside the three huge battle coaches in the garage caught Theo by surprise. With long gleaming snouts and bulbous insectoid eyes, They looked like Hollywood extraterrestrials. They were Dooney drivers, he realized, dressed in some kind of battle rig, with helmets over their long equine heads. The vehicles themselves were even bulkier than the utility coaches that had brought them into Hellebore House, with heavy leaf-textured armor around the sides and front and rear bumpers, but with tops that seemed to be a single dome of black glass. His guardian constables thrust him into a seat in the middle coach, shoving him so hard that he feared for Applecore, who was still clinging to his neck. Lord Hellebore and Tansy and a pair of ogre bodyguards climbed in after them, the ogres even bulkier than was usual with their massive kind, because they were wearing some kind of flak jackets. The terrible child entered last. "You will stay where you are until I tell you otherwise," Hellebore instructed Theo, who found that to be quite true. He could move his head, even adjust his position in small ways, but he sure as hell wasn't going to be getting up and going anywhere. At first, he couldn't make out anything through the dome that surrounded them, except the dim marsh gas glow of the lights in the garage ceiling. But as they came up the ramp and out into the filtered sunlight, he could see all around with complete clarity, as though they rode in an open-top car and nothing stood between him and the world except a pair of polarized sunglasses. Nothing seemed unusual inside the compound, as the lines of Hellebore's guards moved quickly and efficiently to the side of the road to let them pass. But when they rode out between the blocky gatehouses, Theo could see how things had changed even just during the time they had been indoors. The streets of the Moonlight District were crowded too now, and the mixture of goblins and other fairy folk from the lower end of the social ladder looked angry. Although a little surprised by the appearance of the Hellebore coaches, some of the mob scrambled out into the road to block the way. The battle coaches simply drove on. Theo saw at least one goat-horned fairy fall and disappear beneath the wheels of the front vehicle. But rather than frightening off the rest of the throng, it made them angry and brought many more of them surging out from the sidewalks. The lead battle coach struck a half-dozen more people before it had to stop. The rioters began to press in tightly on all sides, surrounding Theo's coach as well. Faces flattened against the dome, an array as bizarre as a Bosch painting. Fists thumped on the doors. A few bolder members of the crowd were climbing onto the hood. "There are too many, my lord," the driver announced from the front compartment. "Drive over them." "There are too many," another voice said, stubborn despite obvious fear at contradicting his master. "This is coach 1. We already have bodies jammed in the wheel wells. A few more and it will slow us down so much we'll be undergoing unacceptable risk. They're dragging paving stones out down the street to block the way. We could survive a few firebombs, my lord, but if we're stuck in one place, eventually the heat dispersal charms will lose their effectiveness." "Use the guns." "But there are hundreds of bystanders trapped in this street, not just the ones blocking our way." "Use the guns, or I will have you thrown to the mob." Hellebore sat back in his seat. "Now, Tansy, tell me what happened at the removers. I have not had time to review the transcripts very thoroughly." A loud noise like a bandsaw penetrated the bubble of Theo's vehicle as something sprayed from the sides and front of the lead car, turning the closest rioters into little more than a mist of red, knocking down scores of others for what seemed like hundreds of yards in each direction. People were fighting to get away now, sliding off the hood of Theo's coach, knocking over the slower wounded in their hurry to escape, and stepping on those who had fallen. Dozens of fleeing fairies, skidding and stumbling on the blood-spattered road. The lead car lurched forward, but there were still too many upright bodies in the way, and the industrial whine rose again. Something ticked onto the hood of Theo's coach, rolled halfway up the window, then slid down again. It was not just a bullet, he saw in a brief glimpse, but more like a tiny, rigid lamprey, its toothy, circular jaw irising open and closed, even as it fell away into the road. Theo's stomach convulsed, and hot bile rose into his throat, but he had nothing left in his stomach to vomit. Within moments, the convoy was bumping along once more, driving over still twitching bodies while the crowd ran screaming in front of them. People on the roofs or in upper windows flung down stones that thumped on the coach's hardened dome like a drunk percussionist. Theo could actually feel the pleasure emanating from the small figure beside him at all this destructive upheaval. Waves of glee pushing against his thoughts like buffeting winds. Hellebore seemed hardly to notice any of it, but Tansy was clearly finding it difficult to talk. The Daisy Lord still had the look of a porcelain doll whose face had been repaired with faulty glue, and it seemed to be giving him pain. His stare flicked from side to side, drawn to the carnage all around. My lord, please, I thought your son acted with your express orders. He did, up to a point. It is the point where he diverged that I wish to ascertain. We listened with the spider for a while. The remover said... He said... Tansy's voice dropped into a conspiratorial whisper, and Theo could no longer hear what he was saying. Here, Theo. The pull was as strong as Hellebore's spell of command, but more subtle, like the compulsion to stare at a terrible accident. Look here. Theo turned toward the child. Do you know what they call me? The boy asked out loud. He had pulled his thick cloak around him, as though the car were a sled racing across the Russian steppes, only his small, round face and the tips of his stubby fingers visible. The eyes held Theo's gaze. His helplessness terrified him. They call me the Terrible Child. It's a title, really, not a name, because, of course, I have a name, even though no one uses it. You know what it is, don't you? Theo tried to answer, but a nightmare weight was pressing on his chest, and he could not breathe. It's Theo Vilmos. The child laughed, showing the tip of his tongue between his small, shiny teeth. My name is Theodore Patrick Vilmos. You were given my name, and my parents', but they were never truly yours. You are just another violet child, the last and least of a dead family. You know, I see my parents sometimes in your dreams, Anna and Peter. I make them rise up from your memories just so I can see what they looked like, so I can laugh as I watch you struggling to apologize to them, even while you hate them for your own shortcomings. Sickened to hear their names out of that mouth, Theo finally found the air to make his voice work. They weren't your parents. You might have been their child to begin with, but you're not anybody's anything now. You're a freak. A messed up, inhuman freak. The boy nodded, not at all displeased. I am the only one like me. That is true. There are worse things to be, of course. Average, or less than average. A failure. A non-entity. Speaking of which, did you know I was with you in Daffodil House? As you stumbled around in the smoke and dust, I was watching it all through your eyes, drinking your thoughts. Oh, the poor little fairy folk. Oh, the destruction. How sad. I drank your fear, too. It was a very pleasant experience, actually. So at least you're good for something. Theo tried to strike at the child, but could not lift his hand more than a few inches off his lap. Struggling hopelessly, he let out a little moan of frustration and despair. The boy smiled. Even now,
You are only still alive because of what other people did years ago, not because of anything you've done yourself." He paused for a moment and sniffed. "That sprite is still with you, isn't she? Hiding somewhere. I can smell her." He smacked his lips and opened his eyes wide in a grotesque parody of juvenile pleasure. "Yum! It's too bad I've already eaten quite a lot for my afternoon meal. She would be very sweet, I think, and crunchy." I think we're going to stop there. Crunchy is always a good word to end on. So, now we've trickled just a little past 3 o'clock. Not that I have any hard and fast. I'm wondering, we might even, how much we got? 7? No, we got a lot. We've still got probably another week's worth of reading after tomorrow. I forgot there's like an extended. Anyway, there's still more. We're not going to finish up tomorrow night. I thought we might for a moment. Anyway, up and there is my dear mother-in-law checking in from Aldridge in the West Midlands. Hello, Hazel. Love to everybody. Mwah. Many kisses from our house. And Anthony, hello. Lovely to see you. Or if you're coming in from England, you might be Anthony, because we tend to use the th sound, but in England they tend to use just the T sound, even though there's an H in there. But I don't know where Anthony is contacting me from, so we'll find out some other time. Anyway, so with that, we have reached the end of our broadcasting day, our Tadcasting day, and I want to thank you all, as I always want to, for joining me and for humoring me and hanging out with me. I will be back Sunday, which is now, today, but at 7 p.m. my time. It is now 3 o'clock my time, so you can see that's 3 in the morning my time, so it's still many hours away. But we will be back. For those who are only catching the shows intermittently, they are available on YouTube, on tadwilliams.com, on my 2 Facebook pages, and my Twitter stream as well. And soon we'll have to add other things to that as well, I'm sure. But for the moment, that's quite a few places to find it if you're really that much of a glutton for punishment. I also want to say, besides being so pleased to have you, to take care of yourselves. As I always like to remind you, take good care of yourselves, take good care of your loved ones, your neighbors, your friends, people who need it. And there's still a lot of people in need out there, even with the vaccinations coming in. And in fact, there's always people in need of a little friendship, a helping hand, some human contact. So that's a good thing to remember. And with that, I will bid you a very fond good night from the Beale Williams Rancho here in California, and say again, what a pleasure it is to have you with me. And thank you for indulging me, and I will see you later on. So good night, everybody. Be good. Peace be upon you. See you soon.